When the guns of World War II fell silent, the world breathed a sigh of relief, but only for a moment. A new war was beginning, not fought with tanks and trenches, but with spies, ideologies, and weapons powerful enough to erase humanity. This was not World War III, but it could have been. This was the Cold War. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent, a new conflict emerged, one unlike any seen before. The globe stood divided between two towering giants, the United States and the Soviet Union. But this was no ordinary war. There would be no great battlefield where soldiers clashed head-on. There would be no great battlefield where soldiers clashed head-on. Instead, it became a contest of ideologies: capitalism versus communism, East against West. Each side armed itself with terrifying stockpiles of nuclear weapons, weapons capable of ending human civilization. The real question was never just who had more bombs, but who controlled the future of the world. From Stalin to Reagan, from the Korean battlefields to the Cuban Missile Crisis, from the building of the Berlin Wall to the fall of it, this is the long, dramatic story of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain falls in the aftermath of Nazi Germany's defeat. Europe lay shattered. The Soviet Union, which had lost almost 27 million lives during the war, now sought a buffer zone of security. Joseph Stalin imposed communist governments across Eastern Europe, turning them into what would soon be known as the Eastern Bloc. Meanwhile, the United States emerged stronger than ever, its economy booming and its military unmatched. America also held a weapon no other nation possessed: the atomic bomb, which President Truman had unleashed on Japan to end the war. It was British Prime Minister Winston Churchill who captured the moment. Best, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Tensions rose when Stalin refused to withdraw Soviet troops from Iran and tried to pressure Turkey over the control of the Turkish Straits. Truman answered with the Truman Doctrine, pledging military aid to nations like Greece and Turkey to halt Soviet expansion. This strategy of containment became the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy for decades. To further counter communism, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, funneling nearly $13 billion to rebuild war-torn Europe. The belief was simple: if people prospered, they would resist communist ideas. Berlin divided. Nowhere was the world split clearer than in Germany. The Soviets ruled the East, while the U.S., Britain, and France controlled the West. Berlin, sitting deep in Soviet territory, was also divided. In 1948, Stalin launched the Berlin blockade, cutting off supplies to the western sectors. Truman responded with the Berlin Airlift, a daring operation that flew food and fuel into the city for 15 straight months. The gamble worked. Stalin lifted the blockade, but the divide was permanent. Soon, two separate German states were declared: West Germany Federal Republic in 1949, and East Germany German Democratic Republic soon after. That same year, the U.S. and its allies formed NATO, a military alliance built to defend against Soviet aggression. The Soviets answered years later with their own pact, the Warsaw Pact. Meanwhile, the newly formed CIA quickly grew into a powerful organization operating covertly around the globe. By the early 1950s, it was toppling governments in Iran and Guatemala, replacing leaders suspected of leaning toward communism with pro-American regimes. The Cold War spreads to Asia. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist forces triumphed in China, creating the People's Republic of China. Alarmed, the U.S. poured resources into Japan, hoping to strengthen it as a capitalist ally in Asia. But the true test came in 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States, fearing the so-called domino effect, sent troops to defend the South. After 3 brutal years and millions of deaths, the Korean War ended in stalemate. The border hardly shifted, but America claimed victory. In one sense, communism had been contained. From Khrushchev to Kennedy, when Stalin died in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev rose to power. He was bold, fiery, and unpredictable. He created the Warsaw Pact, threatened Britain and France with rockets during the 1956 Suez Crisis, and was even rumored to have banned his shoe in anger at the United Nations. But Khrushchev's biggest gamble came in Berlin. Millions of East Germans had fled to the west through the city, draining the East of skilled workers. In 1961, he gave President John F. Kennedy an ultimatum: abandon Berlin. Kennedy refused. Desperate, Khrushchev ordered the building of the Berlin Wall, a concrete scar stretching nearly 100 miles, guarded by soldiers and mines. It became the most visible symbol of a divided world. The Cuban Missile Crisis, meanwhile, only 90 miles from Florida, Cuba had fallen to communism under Fidel Castro. Kennedy tried to overthrow him with the Bay of Pigs invasion, but it ended in humiliation. To protect Castro, Khrushchev secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. In October 1962, U.S. spy planes spotted them. Kennedy responded with a naval blockade, moving the world to the brink of nuclear war. For 13 tense days, humanity stood on edge. One Soviet submarine even prepared to launch nuclear torpedoes, believing war had already begun. Only the calm decision of Officer Vasily Arkhipov, who refused to authorize the strike, prevented catastrophe. Eventually, both leaders struck a deal. Khrushchev withdrew his missiles. Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba. The crisis passed, but it left behind a chilling lesson: nuclear war had come terrifyingly close. Vietnam, America's quagmire. By the 1960s, the U.S. was deeply entangled in Vietnam. Determined not to let another country fall to communism, President Lyndon B. Johnson escalated troop deployments. But the war dragged on. Brutal combat, endless casualties, and televised coverage turned public opinion against the war. By 1968, protests erupted across the world, especially in America. Eventually, the U.S. pulled out in 1973. 2 years later, Communist forces captured Saigon, unifying Vietnam under their control. The cost was staggering: millions dead, entire nations scarred, and U.S. credibility shaken. Stagnation in the East. While the U.S. wrestled with Vietnam, the Soviet Union under Leonid Brezhnev slid into corruption and stagnation. Living standards fell, dissent grew, and uprisings across Eastern Europe were crushed under the Brezhnev Doctrine, which justified military intervention. Seeking stability, Brezhnev entered into negotiations with U.S. President Richard Nixon. The result was SALT I, the first treaty to limit nuclear weapons. A new phase of the Cold War had begun. Dayton, a temporary easing of tensions. The Reagan era, pressure and reform, but détente faded. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, reigniting hostilities. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, reigniting hostilities. By the 1980s, U.S. President Ronald Reagan took a harder line, branding the USSR the evil empire. His policy was peace through strength, outspending the Soviets in a new arms race. Central to this was the Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI), nicknamed Star Wars, a futuristic missile shield involving lasers and satellites. The Soviets, far behind in technology, simply couldn't keep up. Gorbachev and the end. In 1985, a new Soviet leader arrived, Mikhail Gorbachev. Recognizing his nation's economic decay, he introduced reforms, perestroika restructuring, and glasnost openness. He also sought peace. Meeting Reagan repeatedly, the two leaders built trust, culminating in the INF Treaty of 1987, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles. But change spread faster than Gorbachev imagined. Eastern European nations, freed from the shadow of Soviet tanks, began demanding independence. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and by 1990, Germany was reunified. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved into 15 independent states. The Cold War had ended not with a bang, but with a collapse. For more than 40 years, the world had lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. And yet, the conflict ended without a Third World War, a quiet but extraordinary conclusion to the most dangerous rivalry in human history.